Yo, what is up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing our Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate State of the Format Address episode. This is the big one. This is the big info dump, the one where I give you all the information I know about the set to help you win more, to help you trophy more. I'm happy to say that I am coming to this episode from a place of relative success in the format. I've done really well in the format so far. I'm about, I want to say 20-ish drafts in, maybe a little more than that. I've trophied 10 times. My win rate is about 67% in best of one. So I've had a lot of success with the format, and I would like to share with you, all of you out there, what's been working for me, and hopefully get you trophying more. Also, just to kick us off here, I did want to start by saying that I am really enjoying this format. I'm having a good time, and obviously, when I am winning early, it's very easy to have a good time. Your early win rate often colors your opinion of a format, but positively and negatively. You can often give a format kind of an unfair treatment if you aren't, it's not clicking with you, but also you can, maybe overlook some blemishes on it when you're having a good time. But compared to, let's say, Streets of New Capenna, which, I thought was solid overall as well, I am enjoying this set a little bit better. I think that the gameplay is pretty cool. I think the cards are really cool cards, the new ones. The draft maybe is not the most, exhilarating or the most thought-provoking. I think it's just a lot of the times, like we'll get into it, is just take the good cards. it's not too complex. But at the same time, I think that this set has a lot to offer. And despite some color imbalance, which again, we'll get into that as we go in, I found that I've been winning with a wide variety of decks. So I kind of just wanted to, throw my vote in for this set amongst the voice of community members and content creators that, some have definitely defended the set, but I think most of the voices I have heard are, this set's not so good. And so, I can clearly point at some failures and their shortcomings of this set. But, going into the episode today, I just wanted to say that I've mostly found this an enjoyable experience, and maybe if you've been on the fence a little bit, I would give it a try. I think, kind of like I alluded to earlier, one of the things that can really color your opinion of a format is when things don't really click for you early on. Sometimes you look at a card and you go, oh, that card looks pretty good, and you keep putting it in your deck, and then it doesn't end up being good, or vice versa. Card that looks not very good, you keep getting beaten by it, and that can cause some kind of dissonance in how you're experiencing the set. One of my goals with these State of the Format Address episodes is kind of just to recalibrate people, and so that maybe, you didn't have such a good time on your first few drafts, recalibrate you with the format, get you up to speed on what the best cards are, what the kind of cards that don't look so good, or maybe look a little bit worse than they actually are. And then, if you still don't like the format after that, that's totally fine. Not everybody has to like every format. But, I do know that there's a lot of people out there who, they're just missing that initial push, and then kind of unlocks the set for them, and they can enjoy it to, the degree they would like to. Anyways, just before we jump in, of course, I want to mention the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the #1 place that you can go if you'd like to support the show. There's a lot of reward tiers over there for people who choose to support the show. A lot of benefits that we want to give back to you. They range from coaching tiers to draft log and deck tech tiers. There's a lot of tiers over there that give you direct access to me and my thoughts on, how you might want to build your decks, your draft logs, that kind of stuff. Often, just to get you, once again, calibrated with the format can really often help just to have somebody else's thoughts and opinions, even just on a few of your drafts. So check that out if you're interested. There's also the Limited Level Ups Discord. That's a free Discord, bit.ly/join the Discord. Cord, spelled with a CH, like in corticals. There's also some secret channels in the Discord for those Patreon members. Patrons at any tier get to see those channels. That's where you get the most direct access to me. I'm always free over there for a ping if you wanted, a look at a deck or, again, a draft log or something like that. I do truly feel that the best way to quickly level up, especially in your limited game, is just to get some second opinions, some second thoughts. You can get that either from the Discord or from those extra channels where you've got, people like me, people like Jason ILTG, who I will shout out as the best of 3 trophy leader right now, with a whopping 90 win percentage. Jason's in my Discord a lot, helping with deck techs and stuff. So again, if you want to check that all out, it's all there on the Patreon and on the Discord. All right, so let's jump in. On these episodes, I like to start big picture and then narrow in as we go. I often like to talk about the most overarching ideas, or the biggest overarching ideas that I think if you just keep these things in mind, they will really help you. They'll help color the format, and just the most important things about the format. For Neon Dynasty, for example, I talked about in this spot how important sagas were. For the last set, for Streets of New Capenna, I talked about how dominant brokers were, and I think the #1 thing that I can talk about in this set that colors how I'm seeing the format is the color rankings, because there is some disparity. I will say that white is awesome. Just such a fantastic color. I'm going to get into what makes these colors great and maybe not so great a little bit later, but just starting with, if you can start your draft with a good white card, and you're in a pod where maybe people don't know that the white cards are really good, you're in a really, really great spot. And even if you are in a pod where people know the white cards are really good, there's a lot of them to go around. So even if you have 2 other or 3 other people at the table drafting white, it's not that bad to start in white and keep going down that path if it's at all open. Black is also really quite good. It's not quite as good as white, but it's pretty close. I think there are fewer absolute premium black commons compared to the number of white ones, but the ones that it does have that are good are really solid, good uncommon, same with white. Then we've got red and green, which in my mind are very, very close. I like green a little bit better if I'm to choose one. I know if you ask some other really good players, they'll say they like red a little bit better. So, neither of them, I don't feel very strongly about, giving the number 3 spot to either one. I think that you could just call it a tie and call it a day. Both of them pair very well with the 2 best colors, white and black, so that's definitely a point in his favor. I like green's commons a little bit more. I think there's more good ones than there is red, but red's got a lot of good stuff going for it too. And then there's blue. Blue is just... Man, it's funny, I think blue might actually be worse than it was in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, and it wasn't very good back then. In fact, it was dead last back then, and I think it's even, further than dead last. If I could invent some other color to put in between, I probably would and call blue 6, because there's just so few blue cards in the set that I care about. None of the commons are cards that I quote-unquote care about. I can point out some reasonable ones, but there are very, very few cards. I'm talking 4 cards in the entire set that would make me want to draft blue. So big picture, these color rankings really do influence how I'm approaching each draft. And I will say, while white is the king here, it's, sitting on the throne, the middle 3 colors, black, red, and green, they're within the vicinity, right? They're right outside the castle, and blue is way off in some other kingdom or something. I really do think you should... If you're at all considering picking a blue card, reconsider it. That's how much I feel about blue. Don't try to convince yourself that the blue card might be a little bit better than it looks, because even if it is, that means you have to put other blue cards in your deck, and that's a big problem. So this is really, one of the bigger factors on how I'm viewing the format. Next up, the next big picture point I want to point out is removal is good. Removal is good strategically in this format. It is a class of card I would like to put in my deck, and the removal spells just happen to be some of the better ones we've seen. So there are some formats that I can point out. Midnight Hunt is always the example I give of, in Midnight Hunt, you just didn't want too much interaction because your opponent was playing a bunch of Organ Hoarders and Disturb creatures. Not a ton of value creatures running around in this format. You don't feel bad about casting a removal spell on your opponent's 3 and 4 mana card. There's also a bunch of mechanics in this set that actually incentivize you to have removal spells, such as Double Team. Double Team really wants you to have a removal spell in hand so you can kill your opponent's 2-drop before they get an attack and get another copy. Specialize. Your opponent goes, all right, I discard a card to specialize. You go, all right, kill it in response. They kind of 2-for-1 themselves there, right? It also just so happens that the removal spells are actively good cards in this format, just as magic cards, right? There's sometimes where you go, okay, I have to put removal spells in my deck kind of as a necessary evil, but it just so happens that Patriarch's Humiliation, which is a 1-mana instant that deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures you control, and then that creature loses all abilities. Grim Bounty, classic Grim Bounty, 4-mana destroy a creature, you get a treasure. Dragonfire is another really good one. I can go down the list of pretty good removal spells in this format, just cards I want to have in my deck because they're good magic cards, and on top of that, like I said, they do line up well against the format. Patriarch's Humiliation, in particular, I do want to call this card out. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is the best removal spell we have played with as far as, as long as 17 lands has existed, or as long as Arena has existed, a common anyways. The fact that this card is 1 mana, it's an instant, it almost always kills what you want to kill, because it's pretty rare that you're just not going to have enough creatures that this doesn't kill at least something relevant. The fact that your opponent can't save their creature in response to an indestructible trick, which does come up a lot because of the hippogriff that gives indestructible as the adventure side. Also, there's another indestructible trick in the format. There's a black one that, so many times early in this format, my opponent's been gotten by that. I've cast Humiliation. They go to save their creature. It doesn't work. It also just takes off abilities from creatures. So on turn 2, I've had places where I've been on the draw. My opponent goes land. I go White Source. They go land. They play the O2 mana producing creature, the dragon. and I just go, all right, humiliate it, and it loses all abilities, and it's just an O2, and that's just good enough, right? It's like bolting the bird. So really, really prioritize Patriarch's Humiliation. This is the best of the best. But again, the other removal spells are pretty good, and I do want, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7, maybe. That's maybe a bit high, but I'd be happy with, the minimum I would want in my deck is like 3, I would say. There's a lot of formats where I advocate taking good creatures over the removal. This is not quite, I wouldn't say don't take good creatures over removal spells, but really ask yourself, how good is this creature? Is it better than Patriarch's Humiliation? Probably not, because Humiliation is really, really good. Same goes with Grim Bounty, same goes with Dragonfire, even though I do think those cards are just a bit below Patriarch's Humiliation, kind of in the rankings. My next big picture point here is cheap cards are at a premium. I've heard a lot of discussion about people saying, well, as soon as I started taking cheap cards over the maybe slightly flashier or cool looking expensive cards, I started winning more. And I think that's very true. I think that not only are the cheap cards just quite powerful, I was just talking about Humiliation, but there's a lot of cheap creatures that are really good. Steadfast Unicorn, the 1-mana 1/2 that pumps your team. Shambling Ghast, something like Guildsworn Prowler, 2-mana 2/1 Death Touch. When it dies, if it wasn't blocking, you draw a card. There's a laundry list of good cheap cards. The Double Team cards are another one that I really like in this set. And plus, your opponents are going to have these good cheap cards in their deck too. So it's kind of an arms race where if you don't have the cheap cards, you're really going to fall behind because your opponents are going to. So you kind of need to come to the battle prepared with, I would say something in the neighborhood of 8 cards that cost 2 or less mana in your deck. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't some good expensive cards, and it's not to say that you don't want to put expensive cards in your deck. In fact, we saw a very similar dynamic in Avengers of the Forgotten Realms, where people kind of realized, this is a pretty quick format. When my opponent plays a hard-to-block 3/1 on turn 2, I'm in a lot of trouble if I don't have, let's say, a Shambling Ghast on the battlefield, right? And I think the natural instinct was to go, okay, I put all the 2-drops in my deck as possible, and I won't get run over by the aggro decks anymore. And that's a reasonable, natural response. But what happens naturally is that everybody's putting a bunch of 2-drops in their deck. Like, hypothetically, let's just say you had 15 2-drops in your deck, and your opponent also had a similar number, 15 2-drops. Well, what would actually happen is both players would always have a 2-drop on turn 2, have a cheap creature on turn 3, but then as the game goes on a little bit, because, it does actually start to slow down, the game starts to slow down if everybody's kind of coming prepared and isn't dying to the 2-drops, the person who lands a 4-drop or a good 5 or a 6-drop does actually come out on top, because one person's deck is filled with, a bunch of cheap stuff, a bunch of 2-drops, and somebody's deck is filled with a few good expensive things, like a few, let's say a Hill Giant Herdgorger or a Dread Linerum, just these giant massive creatures. So what it comes down to for me is I want to optimize the number of cheap cards I have in my deck, so I have a number that I'll likely have a few in my top 8 or 9 cards, right in my opening hand, so I can kind of compete in the game. I won't just get run over. But then, don't ignore the good expensive cards as well, right? I'm going to get to a few of them as we go on, but all these big green dummies that are pretty good in this set, don't ignore those. There's a lot of expensive, flashy rares that are pretty good. You just have to make sure you prioritize the cheap cards first, and then you can kind of eat your dessert after, right? Because anything is possible if you've fulfill the requirement of having those cheap cards. The problem is you can't play the good expensive ones if you don't have the cheap ones. Another point kind of related to this is really put a premium on the cheap cards that are good on turn 5 or 6, right? Stuff like the Guildsworn Prowler because it has Death Touch. Stuff like Steadfast Unicorn, which is still a good top deck on turn 7 or 8 or something. If you can have a card that helps you get past that gap of surviving the early game and it's still a good top deck on turn 7, that's definitely something you want in this format. My next big picture tip is just play the good cards. And yeah, that sounds obvious, but this is a format that is fairly low synergy. And so what I mean by just play the good cards is if you just pulled up 17 lands and organized by game in hand win rate and kind of just drafted like that for the first little while in your draft, you would do pretty well. There are formats where the opposite is true, where synergy is really important and the value of a card in your deck is contingent on the other cards in your deck. So you can't just look at 17 lands and go, okay, what's the best card here? Okay, let's take that, because maybe you don't have the right cards to go with it, right? This said, I think the good cards are not contingent on the other good cards in your deck. I think if you just looked at what the most winning cards were, they are winning because they are individually powerful cards. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't consider cards that play well together. There are certainly micro synergies that will come up, and you should consider, oh, hey, I've got a unicorn, right? The one-drop unicorn that pumps things. Maybe that means I want a few more, this token maker plays well. This Understellar Myconid plays well, the green mana producer that makes a token. Sure, that definitely matters, and you can make tiebreaker picks there. But I do think that if you try to get cute with synergies, right, if you try to lean too far into building a Dragon's deck or lean too far into building a Blink deck, you're going to get caught up in just playing too many bad cards to make your good cards work. So first and foremost, play the good cards. Play the cards that, the ones where I'm going to get into talking about today. Again, look on 17 lands if you're maybe a little bit shaky on what those cards are. And whenever you put a card in your deck, ask yourself, is it really pulling its weight here, or am I just being a little bit too cute here? Am I trying to make a synergy work that, requires a bad card to work? All right, and my last big picture point here is prioritize cards that play both ways. So I shouted out Jason ILTG earlier, and I had Jason on the podcast a few months ago at this point. We talked about mid-range decks. And Jason's whole mid-range state of mind, his thesis was, I just like cards. This is just from Jason's perspective, how he likes to play. He likes cards that do a very good job of playing both ways. Playing the aggressive role when they need to be aggressive, and playing the defensive role when they need to be defensive. And I think maybe part of why Jason's had such amazing early success in this format is I think the best cards in this format, and you're going to note as I go through the top cards in a second here, the best cards in this format do a very good job of playing both the aggressive role when you need to and the defensive role when you need to. So two of the top commons in the set, the actual two top commons in the set, Guildsworn Prowler, which is the 2-mana 2/1 Death Touch. When it dies, if it wasn't blocking, you draw a card. And Blessed Hippogriff, the 4-mana 2/3 flyer that jumps something and has the adventure that makes something indestructible. Both these cards are good when you're attacking, right? The Guildsworn Prowler is pretty much unblockable. They don't want to block this thing. And the Hippogriff jumps something. But good if you need to be defensive as well, right? You've got the indestructible trick on the Hippogriff. You've also got Death Touch on the Prowler. Being able to play both ways is a really desirable quality in this format because there's a pretty large range of decks that you might face. So you could face the almost mono-red aggressive decks or almost mono-white aggressive decks. But then there's these ramp decks that are trying to cast, they're putting 5 and 6 drops in their deck, right? They just got these giant monsters and they do start to brick you pretty early. So just as a metagame consideration, not knowing in the dark what you're going to face, if you can have all these cards that are good against the aggressive decks and good against the controlling decks, and really you're not making any concessions, right? Sometimes when you're playing a mid-range card or a mid-range deck, you're making a concession one way or the other. You're saying, okay, I'm going to, this card is good against mid-controlling, but maybe not so good against aggro, and vice versa. A lot of the best cards, again, that play both ways are just good against both of these kind of decks. And also, even if you're playing an aggressive deck, if you face another aggressive deck, well, sometimes you're on the draw, right? Sometimes you have to block their double team creatures. Sometimes they just have a really good curve out, and you would like your aggressive deck to be able to defend sometimes, not just be all in mono red aggro. So this is a quality you're going to see on a lot of the cards coming up. If you're not exactly sure what I mean by cards that play both ways, just pay attention to the cards I'm talking about when I'm talking about the top commons. Okay, so let's get into said top commons. Let's go color by color here, starting with white. And the best common in the set, in my opinion, is Blessed Hippogriff. So this is that creature I was just talking about. 3 and a white for a 2/3 flyer. When it attacks something without flying, you control gains flying. And it's got the adventure side, instant 1 white mana, target creature gains indestructible until a turn. It's just such a brutal card. Honestly, if you can ever get to the point where you're curving out and your opponent has to block, and on turn 3 you get to make something indestructible and then play a 2-drop and then play this on 4, it's just an absolute nightmare. Later in the game, this is still a great card. It blanks removal spells, most of the good removal spells in this format. Like I said, not Patriarch's Humiliation, but it just does so much. It's so good on offense and on defense. I really can't say enough good things about it. This is, again, my take for the best common of the set. Then we've got Priest of Ancient Lore. 2 and a white for a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you gain a life, you draw a card. Nothing I can say bad about this card. It's always going to be super solid. There's a few cards that it plays particularly well with that we'll get to in a second. There's also, once again, Patriarch's Humiliation. I'm going to highlight it and reiterate. This card is awesome. And I think it's worth highlighting and reiterating because based on where I've seen it in the draft, I've seen it a bit later than I would have expected. And to be fair, this is a card that we've seen kind of versions of this effect before that have had other restrictions. It can only target something that's attacking or blocking, and this card kind of looks similar to that. I am here to spread the good word that Humiliation it's the truth. It is the real deal. You're going to want as many copies of this card as you possibly can. Those 3 cards are the most premium of premium. Then I'm going to get to Steadfast Unicorn. Single white mana for a 1/2. It's got the ability 3 and a white. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Activate only on your turn. Okay, so number one thing I want to say about this card is both me and my opponents have read this card incorrectly multiple times. So for whatever reason, I think some people think it can only be activated at sorcery speed. Nope, it can be instant speed. It just has to be on your turn. So watch for that in combat. For some reason, I've seen myself, I made this mistake, and opponents, that they think they can only activate it once. No, it's activate only on your turn doesn't mean just once, right? So just watch on the wording on this card. It's a little bit, some of the restrictions that we're used to, this is a different restriction. But then the card itself, it looks a lot more narrow than you would expect it to be. And to be clear, I think this card is just below those top 3 cards, those top 3 white cards I was talking about. This card, I think this is the 5th or 6th most winning card on 17 lands right now, or sorry, common on 17 lands. That's not white common, just common in general. So what does this card do that we like? Well, number one, it's a cheap creature that contributes to creature count for Patriarch's Humiliation, so your humiliations can kill more things. It just, pecks in for a few points of damage often, but really it's the ability here that we're looking at. And it looks kind of innocuous, right? But real few things going on here. One, there's been multiple times where I've drawn this on turn 7, 8, and maybe it's not like a board stall necessarily, but when not one person hasn't completely steamrolled the game, and maybe there's a creature or two on both sides that are able to get in. This completely breaks through that stall and immediately forces your opponent into awful blocks, or they just lose on the spot a lot of the time, even when you're just pumping once. And the vigilance is a big deal too, because you can go all in and they can't crack you back for lethal. Often one of the problems with big pump spells is if you don't just kill them that turn, your opponent can kill you on the crackback. This card does not have that problem. Forget about these times when you can give it +2/+2, because that just breaks the game wide open. There isn't a ton of token makers in this set. There's a few though. There's the Understellar Myconid. There's also an uncommon that makes 3 white tokens for 4 mana. But even without tokens, you've got Double Team, which just creates additional material that you can pump, right? It's not actual like curve out with token makers then pump and you win on turn 5, but you are generating additional creatures over the course of the game with Double Team cards. So you often, if you've got Double Team cards in your deck, you often just have access to more creatures, which makes this card more potent. I would not be afraid to put 2 or 3 of this card in my deck. I think 2 is the most common number. 3 if you do have cards that really play well with it, like Double Team cards or token makers. But don't look at this card as just like, it's kind of a little creature that maybe has a relevant ability later. It's an actively good card. I first picked this card before, really. That's how good I think it is. There's also, you hear something on watch, which is the 1 and a white instant. You choose one, you either deal 5 to an attacker, or you give your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. And this is kind of one of the exact cards I'm talking about, where I'm saying cards that play both ways. Look, if you're getting beat down, it's a 2 mana cheap removal spell. And if you're attacking, that +1/+1 really does help a lot of the time. So this is a card that I think got quite a bit better, actually, from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Because, again, there is just more material lying around on the battlefield. You tend to have more creatures just kind of sitting there. And then the flurry of white cards just doesn't stop. We're 5, 6 commons in at this point. I'm still getting to cards that I really like. We've got a trifecta of white 2-drops. Flaming Fist Dustguard, which is the 2 mana 3/1 that when it ETBs, you get a boon with the next creature you cast perpetually gets +1/+0. We've got Soldiers of the Watch, which is a 2 mana Double Team 2/1. We've got Steadfast Paladin, which is the 2 mana 2/2 lifelink. I like all these cards approximately equally. I do think that Flaming Fist Dustguard is the one that edges out the other two. A 3-power 2-drop is just really nice. You're gonna get some number of games where your opponent just doesn't have anything to do on turn 2. This gets in for 3 free points of damage. Even if they do have something, often you can just there's a lot of ways to leverage a 3-power 2-drop, and we actually saw this a lot in Streets and Capenna, because there's quite a few of those as well. If you think about the Brokers decks with Rafine's Informant and Civil Servant, even if they have a reasonable block, you can then go to yourself, okay, well, I've got a cheap interaction spell, again, maybe a Patriarch's Humiliation, maybe it's turn 4, you've got a Dragonfire, and you can go, okay, well, it's worth it here to kill their 2-drop and then play something else, right? And often you can just get out the gates really quickly, really put a lot of early pressure on your opponent. Aside from that, though, just being a 2 mana 3/1, which is just, I think, a good thing, the boon you get, it's a little more impactful than you might think. Just giving that +1 to a lifelinker, to a flyer, to a Priest of Ancient Lore. One of the slight shortcomings or slight nitpicks I could say about Priest of Ancient Lore, and this is grasping at straws a little bit here, but sometimes your opponent's got, let's say, a Ganassi Rabble Rouser on the battlefield on turn 2, or any 3 toughness 2-drop, and the 2/1 body for 3 isn't all that impactful. You need something that infects the board right away. Well, giving it +1 power goes a really, really long way. So yeah, early on in the draft, and probably for most of the draft, unless something was really, I felt for some reason I really wanted Soldier of the Watch or Steadfast Paladin, I would just take the Flaming Discard. If you ever had to make the choice between Steadfast Paladin and Soldier of the Watch, that's more of a matter of what you have in your pile. Like, if you have enough things that augment your creatures, maybe boon givers, then Steadfast Paladin's probably a little bit better. Or, something like the Griff that can give it flying. If you've got more interaction spells, maybe a bunch of Patriarch's Humiliations, you want the Soldier of the Watch. Well, number one, because you get 2 creatures out of this thing to make your Humiliations better. But number 2, you really do want good cheap interaction spells in your double team decks, or cards, decks with double team cards, so that you can get that first attack in and not have your 2/1 bricked by their early creatures. Next up, we've got black, and top black common, Guildsworn Prowler. I already mentioned this one. 2 mana, 2/1 Death Touch. When it dies, if it wasn't blocking, you draw a card. Just, again, really, really good at attacking. Really good if you want to sacrifice in the late game. Shambling Ghast is my second top common here. It's single black mana, 1/1. When it dies, you either give something -1/-1, or you make a treasure token. Still really good. I think this is a card that people have maybe, like, I've seen some people, just going over the draft logs and seeing people draft, shy away from this card a little bit, because it does look a little low impact, especially if you haven't played with this card before. But just the option to, ramp, accelerate you, or it fixes you, or just, holds off an X1, multiple X1s, hold off their 2/2 at a mana advantage. You play this on 1. They don't really want to attack into this with their 2/2 lifelink, let's say. It really is pretty impactful. And this is to say nothing of if you do have sacrifice synergies in your deck, right? If you have Deadly Disputes or something. So I just want to kind of advocate for Ghast as just a good card, better than it looks if maybe you haven't played with it a bunch. And then, of course, Grim Bounty. That's another really good one. Not too much to say, just solid removal spell. Just like white, black's got a pretty long list here of commons I like. Vampire Spawn, 3 mana, 2/3, comes in, drains, just very solid card. Sewer Plague, 3 mana, instant, 2 and a black. Target creature and opponent controls gets -2/-2 and gains at the beginning of each upkeep. This creature gets -1/-1. So, -2 to start with, and then slowly starts to whittle it down to nothing. This kills most things. I think this card is good, but not amazing. Like, I think one of the, again, small, I'm nitpicking here, but often if you're killing a small thing with this, it's at a mana disadvantage, right? You often want to kill one of, like, a 2-drop or something. And if you're killing a big thing, it takes a little while to kill a big thing, so they get a block in, or they can sacrifice it or something like that. Yeah, this is like small things, but just noting, I think this is a little bit worse than those top quality removal spells, the Humiliations, the Grim Bounty, and the Dragonfire. And then closing out black here, 2 solid cards, Deadly Dispute, Sepulchre Ghoul, both these cards from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. Still, really solid this time around. Maybe toned down a slight bit because the steal and sacrifice stuff has been toned down. The stealing card, Incessant Provocation, is not quite as good, I think, as Price of Loyalty. I don't think anybody's complaining about that, but just worth noting that look at these cards more in the context of what they do just on face value, less so how do they combo with the steal and stack stuff. Worth noting, I do really like Deadly Dispute as just in general as a card. I don't think you need that much to make the card good. Like, it's not that hard to have something, one, you actively would like to sacrifice early in the game, like a Shambling Ghast, or maybe like an Underseller Myconid token or something, or just like a random thing sitting around that got hit by a Sea Tower Imprisonment or some sort of enchantment-based removal spell, or just in response to your opponent casting a removal spell, just having this up, really is a good insurance policy. But sometimes you just like sacrifice your 2-drop so you can hit your land drop, or sacrifice your 2-drop so that you can, a turn early play your Hill Giant Herd Gorger or something like that. So it's just a nice little utility card. I don't think you need that much to make the card good. All right, moving on to red now. And red's got 2 premium commons. We're definitely toning it down a little bit from black and white, which had just like, infinite good cards. Dragon's Fire, like I mentioned, 2 mana, deal 3. If you reveal a dragon card from your hand or control a dragon, you can still instead deal damage equal to that dragon's power to whatever you're dealing it to. And worth noting, of course, I'm sure a lot of people have noticed this, but there are more dragons in the set, so you often do, you're able to make this deal 4 or deal 5 or whatever it is. It's not just deal 3, but deal 3 is still really, really good, so you're not complaining either way. And then Ganassi Rabble Rouser. This is 2 mana, 1 in a red for a 1/3 double team, and it's got the ability 1 in a red. You can pump it, and all other cards named Ganassi Rabble Rouser, they all get +1/+0. So Just really, really nice. All the double team cards for the most part are good. I should say the cheap double team cards. I think that double team does not scale very well as you go up the curve because, you have to pay more upfront and then more for the extra thing you're getting. I think these 2-drop double team cards are quite good. 3-drop ones as well, though. Ganassi Rabble-Rousers, no exception to this. This is a premium card, premium common. You would not necessarily think that a 1 power 2-drop is awesome for an aggro deck, but the 3 toughness is really the big thing here because you can sneak in incidental damage. It's often pretty difficult for your opponent to block a 1-3 that threatens to become a 2-3 in the early games. There's just not that many 3 power things that can block early. And then, you get through that hurdle, jump through that hurdle of, oh, my 2-drop double team creature needs a clean attack. Often this thing does, and then once you get to 2, and if you have multiples, it's really good too. If you've dropped in multiples, you really threaten a lot of damage. So I really, really like this 2-drop. Premium, I would not be sad to first pick it. And then we got just, an assortment of good red aggressive cards here. Hobgoblin Captain, the 3/1 for 2 that gets first strike if you attack with total power 6 or greater this combat. Valor Singer, the 3-mana 2/3 that pumps a creature by +1. Giant Fire Beetles, the 3-mana 2/2 menace double team. Just solid aggressive cards. They fill out your red deck. One thing I'll note though about these cards is all of these cards do only play, or not only play, but play mostly well aggressively. And this is kind of why red is a bit worse than black or white, even as an aggressive color, because these type of cards here, Dragonfire, sure, that's great. And Rabble-Rouser to some extent, that blocks pretty well too. But a lot of these cards really do want to be attacking, like the Captain and the Fire Beetles, right? So if you do find yourself in that spot where you're like, hey, I don't really have the capacity to be the beatdown here. My opponent was on the play. They came up to a fast start. These cards do have a bit of a tougher time tussling with that kind of game state than the white and the black cards generally. And then 2 kind of narrower red cards, narrower but powerful cards that I want to count out here. Incessant Provocation. So this is the active treason, steal for the turn type effect. 4 mana, 3 in a red sorcery. You gain control of a creature, and then it gains the ability forever. This creature attacks each combat if able. So it basically takes it out of the blocking equation, right? Which is a decent effect in just your aggressive decks. You could just put this in like a red-white aggressive deck, and it wouldn't be the worst. I do think though you want to combo this with the Sacrifice Outlet if you can. Again, 4 mana for a steal and then sacrifice combo is a lot worse than 3 because you can't go play this in Deadly Dispute, which is one of the main plays. You can, of course, have Sepulchre Ghoul on the battlefield. On turn 4, you steal something, you sacrifice it for free. That is one of the better things to do. But just worth noting, unlike in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, I haven't found myself really, really wanting to go over after this steal and sacrifice package. Like, it's a fine thing to do if you incidentally pick it up. But it's not just like, pick one, pack one, I have a few sack outlets. Oh, I pick up this provocation. I'll probably just take a generically good black-red card over this. And then Kobold Warcaller. So this is an interesting one. This is a 1 mana 1/1 that has the ability tap a creature card in your hand, perpetually gains haste. So this card is quite effective in some number of aggressive decks. So the things you want to make this card good. Evasion, if you have a flyer, giving a flyer haste is nice. Large creatures, so like in green, red potentially, although that's not a deck I would regularly recommend you drafting, but at least from a hypothetical and an hypothetical lens here, hasting out a large, beefy creature is often better than hasting out like a 3/1, like a white 3/1, for example, that just doesn't have evasion because that just gets blocked. It's nice to do that when your opponent doesn't have their footing under them and you pasted it out on turn 2 and you got in for 3 points because they don't have any blockers or anything. But I think if you put Warcaller in my deck, I want to have this good for top deck situations as well. So again, big creatures, hasting those in. Evasive creatures, hasting those in. Double team creatures. This is a big one too, right? Being able to haste in a double team creature is quite nice. So you get that surprise factor of, often when you have a double team creature, you play it on turn 2 or turn 3, your opponent will leave back their, you have a 2/1 double team creature, your opponent leaves back their 2/3 or whatever. Your opponent won't have that option, of course, if they don't know the double team card is coming. You get a little bit of value. So those are the main things, right? If you've got a good Warcaller deck, it probably means you have double team creatures, evasive creatures, and large creatures that hit hard. Large toughness, I should say. High toughness. Because you don't want your creature just to trade off with like a token or something. Moving on to green. Like I said, I really like green. I think potentially because it has a lot of good commons that are a little bit undervalued. If I'm just looking at where they're taken, both where I see them in the draft, but also in 17 lands, the average less taken at stat. A lot of these premium commons that I have here are taken later than their peers of other colors, like the good white and the good black cards. So the number one common here, Understellar Myconid. This card is awesome. I have so many good things to say about this card. 3 mana, 1/2. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you make a 1/1 sapperling, and you can tap it to add a mana of any color. So one of the main issues with a mana-producing creature is often that the turn that they come down, they don't block very well. Because, you know, to put a good ability on your creature, you have to take away some stats, right? And, you know, here you've got a 3 mana 1/2, not particularly good, but we've seen versions of this card that are like 3 mana 2/1, you know, no other text that adds a mana of any color. And that card's got the problem of, well, I can't really block with this thing because I need to produce mana for me, and it probably doesn't block that well anyways. This card solves a lot of those problems, because if you really do desperately need to block their 3/3, let's say, you can block with the 1/1. But the 1/1 also just trades pretty well with a lot of the 2-drop creatures, sometimes even the 3-drop creatures. Myconid does a great job of shutting down aggressive starts, right? Even if they kill this, you're going to get a 1/1 out of the deal, and that's really good. And often your opponent does want to kill, you know, the adage, bolt the bird. Your opponent kind of has some hesitations. It's like, well, I give them a little bit of value. So that's just like one nice thing I can say to it. 2, the other good green commons that I'm going to get to in a second here are all expensive things. They're 6 and 7 mana, and, you know, 5 mana as well, some of the better ones. And just having this premium mana acceleration creature at common really goes a long way to making those cards castable in the vast majority of your game. Also, just being able to add a mana of any color. That's a big thing too, because a lot of times I'll just have a draft where, you know, I'll just have taken some good black cards, some good white cards, some good red cards, then I move into green, and I end up just playing a Dragonfire or Patriarch's Humiliation, even though I'm not in those colors. I don't end up in those colors because I took them early, and I've got 4 Myconids, and it's like, hey, I can just play this off of this and maybe a few treasure sources, right? I don't have to even put a Plains on my deck if I'm playing Humiliation. So it just lets you play more of your good cards as well, which is awesome. Generally, we're not treated to limited common mana producing creatures as good as this one. So I think a lot of times, you know, you read this card and it looks pretty good, but I think from what I've seen, people have kind of, I won't say written this off, but devalue how good this card is just because it's like, oh yeah, it's mana producing creatures, and generally those are like, you know, fine, but not amazing. Understellar Myconid is a step above that, and, you know, you should consider it as such. We've also got Dread Linarms. This is 7 mana, 6 and a green for a 7/6, can't be blocked by creatures power 3 or less. So almost unblockable. Even if they can block it, they often don't have a profitable block. And then it's also got an instant, 3 and a green. The adventure side here, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, untap it, against hexproof until end of turn. Okay, so number one, let's just talk about the front side here, the creature. Gigantic, often comes down in turn 5 or 6 if you've got enough Myconids in your deck or other accelerants, and both hard to deal with blocking and hard to deal with interaction spells, because not a lot of interaction spells kill this. Another reason why Patriarch's Humiliation is good, because sometimes you can nug this and you do have 6 creatures and you kill it, but also, you know, you can kind of just get rid of that text that can't be blocked by power 3 or less text, and it just turns into like a big dummy, which is a lot easier to deal with. Because often my games end with just, I cast this and the opponent goes, yeah, I just can't block that, and I lose. And maybe they were kind of in like in a head position, but I just go, all right, I'll just chump your creatures for a turn, and this thing's gonna kill you in 2 turns. So really, really premium ramp creature, or ramp target at common. And then the adventure side of this card as well. It's not uncommon for you to get just a 2-for-1 from your Dread Linarm, because the adventure side, putting 2 counters on something, that'll eat something in combat, or it blanks an interaction spell. I will say, I more often than not try to hold this up to blank an interaction spell, if I have the mana to do so, rather than proactively put counters on something to eat something in combat, just because, be careful, your instant, if it gets countered, if your opponent has an interaction spell in response, your Linarm does go to the graveyard. You don't get to exile and cast it later. That is also true for all the adventure creatures. I tend to not to, if my opponent has open mana, try to cast the adventure side. That's a big, I think, kind of misstep that I see people make, trying to get ultimate value out of all of their adventure creatures, even into their, in the face of your opponent's open mana, when that's just asking for a disaster so much of the time. So yeah, if they're tapped out, great, you can use it, but don't feel like you need to use both sides of this card. Same goes with the Hippogriff too. That's another one that commonly comes up. Just save this because the creature sides of those cards are very good. Hill Giant Herdgorger, 6 mana, 7/6. When each of these gain 3, just another really good thing to ramp into. Often comes down turn 5. Often is the biggest thing. Not too much worse than the Linarm. I think that both these cards are neck and neck, but I would probably take the Linarm over the Herd Gorger. Another one that is undervalued by the community, by the way. I think this card goes a little bit later on average. Sometimes I see this almost last pick, and this is one of the better commons in the set. And then, of course, Owlbear, 5 mana, 4/4, trample, draw a card. Always solid. Not quite as good as those other cards, though. Band together, the bite spell, 2 creatures team up and kill something. Really solid card as well. I do want to mention, so since I've had quite a bit of success with these green decks, that you shouldn't be too hesitant to put a bunch of expensive cards in your deck, a bunch of 6 and 7 drops, the Hill Giant Herd Gorgers and the Dread Lunarms. My ramp decks, especially if I've got enough of the Underseller Myconids and Pilgrim's Eyes to help hit my land drops. Maybe I have a few other ramp creatures in there. Generally, those decks lose by getting flooded rather than having too many expensive cards in your hand, because they do a pretty good job of keeping you alive, right? Like often the worry is that, oh, I have all these expensive cards in hand and my opponent ran me over. But especially the Myconid that helps you keeps you alive early. Something like Pilgrim's Eye can help you block while you're setting up. And then once you do get to that threshold of now I'm at 6 mana or now I'm at 5 mana and I can Owlbear into more lands or just keep casting Herd Gorgers, it's really difficult for the opponent to win. They really have to have things line up really, really well, especially because something like Herd Gorger does stabilize you pretty well. But I do think it is a little bit better to head towards, once in a while not being able to play your Herd Gorger on curve rather than not having enough expensive things to ramp into. All right, and then we get to blue, which, as I said at the top of the show, is the problem child. It's got the best quote-unquote common here, Young Blue Dragon, 4 and a blue, 3/3 flyer. It's got an Adventure Side, scry 1, and then draw a card, which is fine. Like, it's an okay card. If this card was in a different color, it would probably be performing better. Like, it's a totally fine card. It's not that exciting, to be honest. It's still just fine. But, it's not a bad card by any means. But past that, we're talking, like, Undersimplify, which is the 2-mana counterspell that has even, I think underperformed. I found enough spots where I feel like I have to get lucky to have this card be good, or I feel like I can sniff it out from my opponent and play around it. And I think this card is very much not Make Disappear, right? I think this card, the Make Disappear, you being able to sacrifice something to make your opponent have to pay the cost twice, have to pay 4 instead of 2. That was a big deal. The -2 perpetually on this card, that matters, but it's if you really need to counter something and the kind of the consolation prize you get is their thing is 2 power smaller, it doesn't really matter when it's like a Dread Lunarm or something or a Herd Gorger, which, mind you, those things do have a good chance of getting countered by this card. But there's even good cheap cards that you do feel like you need to counter sometimes, and you just can't with this. So it's fine, but it doesn't add to at all to blue being a better color than it might be. Air Cult Elemental, Rhyme Shield, Frost Giant, both cards that I think are fine, but also just expensive. Like, blue's got this issue of its cheap cards are bad, and its expensive cards are expensive. And you just can't have a deck full of really expensive cards unless you've got something going on where you've got a lot of mana production, right? So, of course, that leads to the question, well, Alex, what blue cards would you take early to lead you into blue? Well, very short list here. Snowborn Simulacra, which is a mythic. It's X blue sorcerer. You conjure a duplicate of each of X target non-token permanents into your hand. That means anything on the battlefield, not just your stuff, your opponent's stuff. And those cards perpetually gain. You can cast them with any color of mana. If X is 5 or more, you can put one of those cards onto the battlefield. So this is the best blue card in the set, at least mono blue card in the set. Notable because it is one of the only cards I'm going to talk about that requires blue in it. Because all the other blue cards I'm going to talk about are splashable. You can just play them in your deck with a bunch of treasure or green mana producers that make any color. This is the one that does ask you to commit a little bit, right? Is it worth it? It depends what the opportunity cost is, right? If you look at this card, pick one, pack one. What else is in the pack? Is there a Patriarch's Humiliation, or a Blessed Gryph, or a Priest of Ancient Lore, or a Prowler, or just like any other good common I've talked about? I think it's totally reasonable to take one of those cards. I think it's reasonable to take this too, but just know that you're kind of setting yourself up for, well, I need to put X amount of blue mana sources in my deck. And no, to be fair to this card as well, I think this set, the cards in the set and the fixing, the incidental fixing with treasures and the multicolor fixers, there's a bunch of 5-color green fixers, that it exists in a way where I think it is reasonable to cast a blue card in your deck without islands, right? I cast green cards in my black-red treasure deck, for example, that I thought were worth it. And you could still do that. Sometimes the draft doesn't go that way, and you do end up in a spot where you don't get the fixers. Maybe you have to abandon this card. But even if you did have this card early, I would try my best to limit the number of blue cards. Like, don't see this as a sign to go, okay, now I can put the bad blue cards in your deck. No, you still want to mitigate the blue cards, the number of blue cards you put in your deck. More, okay, I have to put either a bunch of fixers in my deck, the good fixers like the treasures and the green fixing, or this is one of my few blue cards and I'm very heavy on my other color. Let's say it's black. So I play a mana base that has enough mana to support mostly my black cards and then a blue card later in the game. But what else? What are the splashable cards? Well, Thayan Invokers is a real nice one. This is the 2 and a blue 1/1 double team that conjures a lightning bolt into your hand. Then when you attack, you obviously get another Thayan Invokers that can conjure a lightning bolt again. This is a card that you can splash very easily. Miram Sentinel Worm, the giant Temur dragon. It's got blue in its mana cost, so I guess it's a blue card. Tasha, Unholy Archmage, is the 2 blue-black Planeswalker. This card is very good. One more thing that I will mention that, again, I will credit to Jason LTG for bringing this up for the first time. Really want to try to not ultimate Tasha, -6 her, before she can survive it. Like, you want to often get her to 7, because I've seen a lot of games where the +1 on Tasha, which is she pluses and your opponent's attacking creatures will get -1 counters when they attack. That's just completely locking down the game. Your opponents can't really do anything. And then, I've been in these games, and then the opponent -6s, and they get like a 2-drop, a 3-drop, and like a 5-drop. And it was much better if they just kept the Tasha on the board, because now their opponent can attack them, and it just wasn't that good. So really, hold off on a turn on that ultimate if you can. And then, those are all rares. Below rare, I think the one card that's got a single mana cost, single mana pip that would want me to play some blue cards, or at least maybe splash the card, is OG, the Exquisite Blade, the 2 white-blue signpost uncommon that blinks things. I've had a lot of good success with this card. Again, splashed, not as my main color. I haven't actually been blue-white, but in like a green-white deck with a bunch of ETB triggers, with Priests of Ancient Lores, with Herd Gorgers, I've found this card to be quite good. And that's kind of it. Like, there's a few other blue cards that are decent. There's like Juvenile Mistdragon, which is the 5 mana 2 or 3 blue 4/3 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, it freezes something for the turn. There's the Seacoast Serpent, the giant 6/6 adventure blue dragon. But again, those are double blue cards, and unlike Snowborn Simulacra, I don't think those are blue cards where I would want to put that many blue sources in my deck to have to cast those cards. Because they're good, but they're just not worth moving into blue for, I would say. Now, maybe, again, you end up in a spot where you just have the good blue cards. You've just got maybe the Snowborn Simulacra, and you've got the Juvenile Mistdragon. And your secondary color is open enough that you don't have to play bad cards, bad blue cards. That is a rarity, though, I think. I just want to keep reiterating, be very sure that you should take a blue card before you actually do it. Okay, so those are the colors. I just want to go over some quick points, some kind of tips that have helped me in my draft. So something I want to talk about here is opportunistic splashing. And this is something I've done a lot. If you look at my 17 lands data, my trophy data, a lot of the decks are 2 main colors and then a small pip, right? A small color that indicates a splash, and sometimes 2 small pips. There's a lot of cards in this set that let you splash cards kind of for free. Like, no splash is ever free, but free enough that playing a good off-color card is better than playing my 23rd card in color, right? And often on stream, this is a question I get often, where somebody will look at a card in my deck. Let's take OG, for example, which is a good card to be fair, but a card that they go, oh, OG is good enough that you would splash it. And it's not like I'm dying to splash OG all the time, right? But a lot of the time, the card I would play over OG is not that good. It's just like a fine, medium playable, maybe like an Underdark Basilisk, let's say in a green-white deck. And I've got a deck on screen here. It's 3 Prosperous Innkeepers, 2 Undercellar Myconids, a Pilgrim's Eye, a Druid of the Emerald Grove, just all these free-ish sources, right? 5 color fixers that make it so that OG will just be castable in so many of my hands. So it's not so much that I think that I'm just jamming all the, I'm trying to pick up cards early in the draft and then shove them all into my deck. But it's just, I end up in places and spots a lot of the time where I've got 7, 8 incidental fixers, and these cards are pretty low opportunity cost to just put in my deck. And again, for those who are not watching, who are listening on the podcast here, I've got this green-white deck here, and I've got OG, 2 copies of it, Ambergris, Citadel Agent, which is the specialized card that when it attacks, you can discard your hand and draw 2, and Black Market Connection. And this deck was great. This deck was awesome. I could cast these cards very, very easily because of the treasure and because of the Myconids. And this is just something you can do, something I would look to do a lot of the time. Don't feel bad about splashing, let's say a Patriarch's Humiliation in your green-black deck or something like that. Just look for places where you can add in more powerful cards when you can. Because again, this set is a lot about individually powerful cards, not about having the most streamlined linear deck, right? It's about shoving a lot of power into your deck most of the time. And next up, I want to mention land counts. So this has been the topic of much discussion on my stream lately. So land counts are a funny thing, just in general. A lot of people are very tied down to 17 lands and never deviate from that. I think also, though, often people, especially in like a red-white aggro deck, like they see they're playing red-white and they immediately default to, I want to play 16 lands because I'm a red-white aggressive deck, right? And while it's a fair shortcut to make when you're just drafting and building your decks, there are a few more direct questions that I think you want to ask yourself when you're figuring out land counts. So in my red-white decks in this format, I have very rarely gone below 17 lands. And I've actually played an 18 land red-white deck because there are so many places to put your mana in these decks. There's double team cards. That's just additional cards that conjure themselves out of thin air that you have mana to spend on them. There's the gate cycle, the uncommon gates that if you float out a little bit, you can draw a spell by activating it. There's specialized cards. They both require mana to put into them and a card to discard, and often you're going to want to discard a land to those. There's Liara, the red-white uncommon. That's a mana sink as well. As it's an activated ability that gives you another card. I would really hesitate to go below 17 lands in my red-white deck. So the question you're asking yourself often in any Magic deck is, how well can I use additional mana? How do I feel after I've drawn my land 5 and 6? And again, it's very intuitive to say, well, in my aggressive deck, I don't want to draw land 5 and 6. I don't think that is true for the red-white aggressive decks in this format. Sort of paradoxically, my green decks in this format will actually be the ones that want fewer lands because the spells in them generate mana somehow, or they get me a land, or they draw me a card, which is, a percentage of a land. So if I've got enough Underseller Myconids and Pilgrim's Eyes and Prophetic Prisms, let's say, these are all cards that would push me towards fewer lands, I can go down a land, especially maybe if I'm having a tough time figuring out what my last cut is, even when I've got a bunch of expensive cards in my deck, because I'm counting overall mana sources in my deck. Lands are just mana sources, right? Spells in your deck can also be mana sources. And when I've got 23 mana sources in my deck, it's okay to cut on a land. Now, you want to be careful about this, right? You don't want to go, oh, I've got 2 Myconids, cut a land, right? To give you some numbers, I think once you've got the first 3 or 4 things that either, draw a cycle to draw you a card like Prism, or draw you a land, or make mana themselves, that's when you can consider skimping on a land. I would also just consider, maybe your 24th card is just worse than a basic land, right? Consider that too. You have to ask yourself, well, how much am I gaining by putting that 20, that extra spell in my deck? Maybe the land is just better. But it is just kind of funny, the kind of that my red-white decks in this format want more lands and my green decks often want fewer lands. All right, next up, I want to talk about some notable cards. So maybe there's some cards that I didn't get to talk about when I was talking about the top commons, either because they're uncommons or rares. Also some cards that I think are overrated, potentially. Some cards that I do want to shout out as, I think by the community currently, overrated compared to where I would generally take them in the draft. So first off here, we've got the Iron Golem Enigma. So if you've at all been following 17 Lands and following some of the discourse on Twitter and on various Discords and on Twitch, you'll note that Iron Golem has been the topic of discussion. This is, of course, 4 generic mana, 5/3 Vigilance. It attacks and blocks each combat if able. And in the early days of the format, I'd say by, on day 2 or something, it had a really high win rate. It had 61 game in hand win percentage. Now, that was at 300 sample size or 200 sample size, so pretty negligible, right? You can kind of write that off as noise. As the days went on, though, it kept that high win rate. Currently, it's sitting at game in hand win percentage of 57 aggregate. With the notable exception that it is currently the second most winning common in red-white. So what's going on here? I think that in red-white, it is actively good. So at a baseline, a 4-mana 5-power creature, like that just hits pretty hard, right? Like forget about any downsides of has to block each turn if able. That hits reasonably hard. So if you can get your opponent's creatures out of the way, if you have a removal spell, maybe they've been a bit slow to start, that's a lot of damage even if it just hits once. And then maybe, you have an awkward spot where it has to block and you didn't want to, yada, yada, yada. But sometimes the vigilance is actually an upside too, so that's worth noting. But 2 cards that I do want to note that do play well with this card and are already very good in red-white are the Blessed Hippogriff, both the side that gives it flying and the side that makes it indestructible, and Kobold Warcaller, the 1-drop creature that gives haste. So hasting this Iron Golem out often means your opponent won't have a good block for it, right? Just like I was talking about kind of the surprise factor of hasting out a double team creature where your opponent often wants to hold something back so you can't get an attack. Same goes for Iron Golem. When they have a 5-power creature coming at you, you just play this non-hasted, they go, okay, I leave back my 3-power creature, I can't take 5 here. But if they go attacking, you can haste this thing out, and again, if you just get in one hit with it, it's pretty nice. And then, of course, the Hippogriff plays well with that too, because your opponent will often block this thing, you get a little bit of a blow on the indestructible side of things, and then this flies over. It also works pretty well with Lulu, the Hollyphant. It's an uncommon specialized creature. It's a 3-mana 1/3 flyer that you get a boon with the next creature you control, it gets flying. So it plays well with that. So I think you should put this card in your red-white deck if you've got some number of those cards. I do think it is actively good there. And this is a really good example of where reading 17 lands, like the aggregate data, and not looking where the data breaks down based on archetypes, can be misleading. Because if you look at how well it's performing in other decks, it's not performing very well. It's performing well when it's paired with those good red and white cards that play well with it. So much so that it is bringing its aggregate win rate up to a point that if you're just looking at, non-filtering by what deck it goes in, it might reach you as, oh, I should just be putting this card in any deck. And that's not the case. So yeah, play it in red-white, probably not anywhere else. Minimus Containment. This is the aura removal spell, 2 and a white. Enchant all impermanents. The enchanted permanent is a treasure. Or otherwise known as 3 mana, destroy a creature, lose the game next turn. I think this card is really quite bad. And based on the 17 lands where it's taken, I think this is the top, it's one of the top 10 most drafted cards in the set, or most drafted commons in the set. And I'm really trying to not put this card in my deck. So when you cast this card anytime before turn 6, I would say, when your opponent still has stuff in their hand, it's really quite bad. Just getting a 3-drop out of the way so you can, the idea of kill their 3-drop so your early creatures attack well and you get a bit of a tempo advantage. That's the reason why you would want to kill a 3-drop so you get ahead on tempo. You're automatically negating that because then they can double spell next turn or play a 5 or a 6-drop or something. And that's just a gigantic cost. Just giving your opponent a treasure, I think it's easy to underestimate how bad that is for you. If you play this past turn 6 or 7, it still could be pretty bad because your opponent might just have a Deadly Dispute, or you unlock their 3rd or 4th color, or they were just missing 1 more land so they could cast their Linarm or something like that. So as much as removal is important in the set, I would really, really try not to stoop as low as Minimus Containment because it's absolute last resort. I have no other interaction. And even then, you have to be really critical about when you're casting it in-game. And another card that is apparently tricking people, or is a trap based on where people are taking it on 17 lands and versus its win rate, which is very not good. It's 52 or something. Dragonborn Immolator. So this is 3 in a red, 2/4. It's got the ability 1 in a red. The Immolator gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and it's got another ability. When it dies, you get a boon where it's the next creature you cast gets a +X, where X is this thing's power when it dies. This thing looks appealing, but it just ends up being not enough for the mana you're sinking into it. So it's a 4 mana 2/4, which is not particularly good. And then the ability is kind of clunky at this point of the curve. And then the death ability is nice, but not that amazing. So just bump this down in your pick orders. If you've been taking it highly, it's just probably a bit worse than you might expect. Battlecry Goblin is another interesting one. So this is 1 red for a 2/2 uncommon. One on red, it says goblins you control get +1/+0 when gained haste until end of turn. It's got pack tactics. If you attack with creatures total 6 or greater this combat, you make a 1/1 tapped and attacking goblin. So this card is still fine. It's just kind of lost its luster. It's lost its mythic uncommon status that it once had. Definitely a solid 2-drop. There's not a lot of goblins that you instantly get bonuses from. Like last time around, there was just goblins flying around, and I think there's only like 1 or 2 in this set. There's a hobgoblin captain and maybe one other. So it's still a decent aggressive card, and it's a good thing to it's just like 2-drop that pumps. And then on if you top deck it, it's okay. But it's not quite like I wouldn't jump lanes or anything for this card. Like it's a totally solid card, but not quite living up to its former glory. Knoll Hunting Party, another kind of like trap adjacent card, I think. 6 mana for a 4/4 double team. As long as it's your turn, it gets first strike, and it costs 1 less for each creature you attack with this turn. I think this card got a lot of heat early on, a lot of hype, and it definitely, maybe partially because it was performing pretty well on 17 lands early on, but it's really fallen off based on, after a lot of more games have been played. I think this card has its moments where you feel really good about it because you're attacking with a bunch of things and it costs 1 mana. It's a little too feast or famine-y, though. I've played with this card a decent amount, and I think that it's been stuck in my hand, or at the very least has forced an awkward attack from me more often than I would like to. So it's like, if you're on the play and you've got clean attacks, you can play this on turn 4, and it feels pretty good. But too often, I think it clunks up my hand. So just shouting this out as one that looks awesome. Again, you might hear some people say it's fantastic because there's definitely part of the range of this card is you experience the 1 mana version of this, and it's really good. But I do think on average, it's not that good. Last cards here, Scaled Nurturer and Follow the Tracks. The 2 ramp spells, 2 green ramp spells. 2 mana, 0/2 for the Scaled Nurturer. Taps, add a green. When you cast a dragon spell with this mana, you gain 2 life. And Follow the Tracks is the 3 mana ramp spell that can go get a gate you conjure a gate, put it on the battlefield. Both these cards, I think, are like 2nd or 3rd rate fixers. Like, unlike Understellar Myconid, neither of these really affects the board when they come down. Follow the Tracks literally doesn't. Scaled Nurture, that 0/2 blocks pretty much nothing. So really they don't really hold a candle to the Myconid. Even something like the Walrus, the artifact creature, like that scries when it comes in and adds any mana. I think that's even a little bit better than these cards if we're looking for a multicolor fixer. And of course, in this case of Scaled Nurture, it doesn't fix at all for multicolor, and that's a big deal. Just making green is a lot worse than just making any color. So yeah, like as much as I've been hyping up the green ramp stuff, these are not cards I would be thrilled to put in my deck. Really looking for the Myconids over these. All right, and just before we wrap up, I did want to give a small touch on the archetypes here, just to kind of contextualize everything I've been talking about. So currently, as of, let's see, what is today? It is July 14th, and as of today, the win rates on 17 lands for the decks are as such. So Boros and Orzhov are neck and neck here. Boros has a win rate of 60.3. Orzhov has a win rate of 60, which makes a lot of sense based on all the nice things I think I've been saying about the red, white, and black cards. Selesnya is actually a recent winner here. It's at a 58.4 win rate. And I actually, this lines up with my experiences. Like I've been saying, I've been drafting a lot of green decks, and often my green decks tend to have white cards in them by virtue of the white cards being very good. Black-red here at 57.9%. Golgari, 56.7%. And we got the tail end here. Simic, Azorius, Gruul, Dimir. Those are all in the low 50s. And then really, really the bottom of the barrel here is it with 49.4 win percentage. And that is in the running for worst archetype of all time as far as 17 lands data goes. I think only Dimir in call time beats it, if memory serves. So yeah, not looking good for Is It. But just to give you a quick overview there, the Mardu colors are great, and the green stuff has been performing pretty well as well. So just to tie the room together here, some finishing thoughts. The double team deck, red white double team. Yeah, just good. Like good red cards, good white cards. I think that red is a color that I was mentioning. I think is probably the fourth color, the fourth best color in the format. Mostly because the red cards only play one way, but of course the aggressive way they play pairs really well with the white cards, and that would lead it to be the red white to be one of the more winning pairs, which makes a lot of sense. All the good aggressive red cards, they're their best home here. And red-white has just a lot of really powerful cards. The double team cards, for the most part, are all very good. The cheaper the double team card is, the better it is. That's a very, you can see that trend if you just look at the 17 lands data. Liara of the Flaming Fist, the red-white gold card, 2/2, that pumps creatures of the same name that you can pay 1 red-white to give something double team until end of turn. Only activate that once, worth noting. A really, really great card. I've actually just played this card in like my non-aggressive decks, honestly, where I just like wanted to have a card that copies something. Like, just that ability is pretty darn good. Just when you have a bunch of really good creatures, it's good to copy stuff. Moving on to black-white here. I'm calling this black-white good cards because that's kind of what it is. Like, it's the most good cards of good cards deck I can possibly imagine. Like, so you've got the theme, the prescribed theme is when things leave the battlefield, you get a bonus. And you see this on Minthara the Absolute, which is the gold card, which is pretty good. I do like Minthara quite a bit. But for the most part, I get into this deck because I'm like, oh, great, good black and white cards. I'm sold. Like it really doesn't take me a lot to get into this deck. It's a deck I find myself in pretty often. Some slight synergies you might encounter, but again, this set is very much not about like overarching synergies. So just be drafting good cards, and that's a big picture tip I would give to you. Just don't ever take bad cards. This is the advice I've given to a lot of people so far. Like, I've seen a lot of people try to stay in their color for bad cards. Like, they're like, okay, this isn't a very good white card, but I'm in white. No, just take that green card. Take the Underseller Myconid over the 6 mana 3/4 double team creature, because that's not a great card. That's just like, I don't care about that card very much. Take the green card because you might end up in green. Who knows? You might splash, right? I just think the good decks in this format are so contingent on how many good cards you can play in your deck. Very much not, just like weird synergies. And so I guess that's not really, that's kind of a separate thing from what I'm talking about, taking bad cards to stay in the color. But both those ideas apply. Just like, don't stop taking good cards in the draft is really what I'm trying to get at here. And that definitely applies to black-white. Black-red, Treasures. This deck, kind of a bit of a fall from grace. It's still a fine deck, but definitely not as good as it was in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. Like, again, the Incessant Provocation is a reasonable bit worse than Price of Loyalty. 4 mana is just a lot more than 3 when you're considering a Steel and Sack turn. There's also just less treasure running around, so like your Kalane, Reclusive Painters, don't get you don't get to buff your creatures as often as you might have in the previous set. Also, the red cards don't play as well here as they do in a red-white deck, for example. Like I said, they kind of only play one way, and your black decks tend to be a bit on the grindier side. So the red cards don't actually synergize all that well with the black cards. And if you look on 17 lands, the top cards in black-red that are performing are mostly black cards, not red cards, right? So if you do decide to move into black-red, make sure it's for the right cards. Make sure it's for just, a good gold card like Kalane, or Incessant Provocation if you've got good sacrifice synergies, not just like generic red aggressive cards like you might be happy playing in your red-white deck. Green-white, the deck that I've been talking about a lot, that I'm calling like mid-range ramp here because the life gain stuff doesn't matter all that much. So Prosperous Innkeeper, which is the 2 mana 1/1 that ETBs you make a treasure token, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. That's just a good card regardless of life gain synergies. But like Trelasera, Moondancer, the green-white gold card that pays you off for gaining life, gets counters and scries. Like, I just don't care that much about that card. Honestly, I'm much more interested. The green cards I'm interested in this deck are the ramp cards, and the white cards I'm interested in are the just good white cards I've been talking about. Again, more just put the good cards in your deck. I find I build this deck as, again, more a ramp deck or a mid-range deck. Not really leaning that much into aggression. Like, you can have some aggressive stuff in there too. Some of the white cards do, once again, play pretty well both ways. But if I'm green-white, I'm often getting into green for Linarms and Herd Gorgers and Myconid, slightly slower cards, right? So there's a bit of dissonance there if you're trying to shove in the most aggressive white cards into your deck with those rampy green cards. And then, Dragons. Unfortunately, I don't think any of the Dragons decks are very good. I think that green-blue is the best one of the bunch. Because one of the problems, like I was noting, about blue is that its good cards are expensive. So if you put the green ramp cards in your deck with the good expensive blue cards, like the Air Cult Elemental and the Rime Giant, the Frost Giant thing, like, that makes it a bit easier to swallow the cost of putting expensive cards in your deck, and also just blue has some card draw that pairs well with the mana production and green does. So like, even when you're there, you don't care that much about dragons in particular. It's just kind of more generic green, blue, draw some cards, play some ramp kind of stuff going on. Maybe you can splash. Sure, if you've got some incidental dragon synergies, that works too. But yeah, all three of these decks have not been good, especially, like I mentioned, blue-red has been really, really bad. I would only really move into this deck if you had like a really, really open green-blue lane for some reason, or you had the rare, the Teamer rare, the 3-color 6/6 flying dragon. Like, that is a good reason to put dragons in your deck where you wouldn't otherwise. All of the other payoffs just are not very good. So, it's sweet, it's cool, but unfortunately, I do not think it is a strategically smart deck to move into. And that is it. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening and for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, I also post this on the Limited Level Ups podcast feed if you want to give this a second listen on the go. And of course, if you are listening on the podcast feed, I post these on the Limited Level Ups YouTube channel. Got all the graphics, all the cards that I'm talking about in front of me. It might be a little bit easier to follow along if you're a visual learner. Once again, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Really, really helps the show keep going, supports everything I'm doing, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Next week, we've got a guest on. We're going to be talking more about this set. Really excited to have this guest on. Won't spoil who it is just yet, but he is an old pro who hasn't been on the scene for a while, and I'm excited to have him back. So yeah, stay tuned for that, and again, we'll see you next time.